The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists began gathering behind the familiar red rope barriers. Among them stood Sarah Mitchell, a 28-year-old teacher from Ohio, clutching her phone and practically bouncing with excitement. This was her first trip to London, and seeing the famous royal guards was at the top of her must-do list. Sarah had spent weeks planning this moment. She'd read every travel blog, watched countless YouTube videos, and even practiced her photo poses in her hotel mirror. The iconic red tunics and towering bearskin hats of the Queen's Guard had fascinated her since childhood, and now she was finally here, just meters away from these legendary figures. The crowd around her buzzed with anticipation as they waited for the changing of the guard ceremony to begin. Families with children pressed against the barriers, elderly couples shared stories of previous visits, and fellow tourists from around the world chatted excitedly in different languages. The atmosphere was electric with that special energy that only tourist hotspots can create. Standing perfectly still at his post was Guardsman James Thompson, a 24-year-old soldier from Manchester who had been serving with the Coldstream Guards for 3 years. His military training had prepared him for many things, but nothing quite like the daily spectacle of curious tourists trying to get his attention. He'd seen it all before: people making faces, telling jokes, even doing silly dances, all hoping to crack his stoic expression. James took his duty seriously. The Royal Guard's reputation for unwavering discipline wasn't just for show, it was a matter of honor and tradition stretching back centuries. Every morning, he put on his uniform knowing he represented something much larger than himself. The heavy bearskin hat, the precisely polished buttons, the perfectly straight posture, everything had to be absolutely perfect. As the crowd grew larger, Sarah noticed something that made her heart race with excitement. One of the guards seemed different from the others. While his colleagues maintained their statue-like poses, this particular guard, James, appeared to have the slightest twinkle in his eye. Maybe it was just her imagination, but Sarah felt like there was something special about him. The ceremony was still 20 minutes away, but Sarah couldn't contain her enthusiasm. She'd heard all the stories about how the guards never break character, never smile, never acknowledge the crowd. But there was something about James that made her think maybe, just maybe, she could be the first person to get a reaction. Other tourists began noticing Sarah's intense focus on the young guardsman. An elderly British couple standing nearby chuckled, quietly, recognizing the look of someone about to attempt the impossible. A group of teenagers with their phones ready started paying attention, sensing that something interesting might be about to happen. James, despite his training to ignore distractions, found himself acutely aware of the American woman's gaze. His peripheral vision, he could see her animated expressions and the way she kept whispering to other tourists around her. He'd developed a sixth sense about which visitors might try something unexpected, and this one definitely had that look about her. The morning air was crisp and clear, perfect weather for the ceremony that drew thousands of visitors to the palace. Gates every day. Street vendors nearby called out their wares: souvenir postcards, miniature guard figures, and "I Love London" t-shirts. The familiar sounds of the city created a backdrop to the anticipation building in the crowd. Sarah checked her phone for the 10th time, making sure her camera was ready and her battery was fully charged. This wasn't just about getting a good photo. She wanted to capture something special, something that would make her friends back home understand why this trip meant so much to her. She'd saved for 2 years to make this journey, working extra hours and skipping countless dinners out. As more tourists arrived, the crowd became denser, but Sarah had managed to secure a prime spot right at the front of the barrier. She was close enough to see the intricate details of James's uniform, the way his white gloves contrasted against the red fabric, and the impressive height that the bearskin hat added to his already tall frame. The anticipation in the air was palpable. Camera flashes began going off as people took preliminary photos, children asked their parents excited questions about the guards, and tour guides started gathering their groups for the best viewing positions. But Sarah remained focused on one thing, the guard who seemed somehow more human than the others, even while maintaining perfect military bearing. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities as she studied James's perfectly still form. She'd read online that the guards were trained to ignore everything. Loud noises, people calling their names, even attempts to physically distract them. But something about his eyes told her there was a person behind that stern exterior, someone who might appreciate a genuine moment of human connection. The woman standing next to Sarah, a middle-aged tourist from Germany, noticed her intense concentration. "You're planning something, aren't you?" she whispered with a knowing smile. Sarah grinned and nodded, though she hadn't quite figured out what that something would be yet. James had been standing at attention for over an hour now, but his training kept him perfectly steady. His muscles had learned to adapt to the long periods of stillness, and his mind had developed techniques to stay alert while appearing completely motionless. But today felt different somehow. The energy from the crowd seemed more charged than usual, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something unexpected was about to happen. As Sarah watched, she noticed the small details that most tourists missed. The way James's breathing was so controlled it was barely visible, how his eyes stayed fixed on a point in the distance, and the incredible discipline it must take to maintain such perfect posture while wearing that heavy uniform. Her respect for these guards grew with every passing minute. A group of children nearby started giggling and pointing at the guards, their parents trying to keep them quiet. Sarah remembered being that age and thinking the guards were like living dolls or toy soldiers come to life. But now, as an adult, she understood they were real people doing an incredibly demanding job, representing their country with dignity and honor. The German woman leaned over again. "My husband tried to get a reaction from one of them 20 years ago," she said quietly. "Told jokes, made funny faces, even tried speaking German. Nothing worked, but you look like you have a different plan." Sarah smiled but kept her eyes on James. She did have a different plan, though it was forming in her mind spontaneously. Instead of trying to break his concentration or make him laugh, she wanted to show appreciation for his service. The idea that began forming was risky, potentially embarrassing, and definitely outside her comfort zone. Meanwhile, James was fighting an internal battle. His training told him to ignore the crowd completely, to focus on his duty and nothing else. But there was something about the American woman's respectful attention that touched him. She wasn't trying to mock him or treat him like an attraction in a theme park. Her gaze felt different, appreciative, even admiring. The ceremony was just 10 minutes away now, and the crowd had swelled to several hundred people. Tour buses continued arriving, disgorging excited visitors who hurried to find good viewing spots. The familiar chaos of a major tourist attraction was in full swing, with parents lifting children onto their shoulders and teenagers jostling for the best selfie positions. Sarah took a deep breath and made her decision. She was going to do something that no guidebook would recommend, something that might get her in trouble with security, but something that felt right in her heart. She was going to show this dedicated soldier that his service was appreciated by trying to give him a hug. The idea seemed crazy even to her, but Sarah had always been someone who followed her instincts. Her friends back home often teased her about being too emotional, too willing to wear her heart on her sleeve. But in this moment, surrounded by hundreds of strangers in a foreign country, that emotional openness felt like exactly what was needed. She glanced around nervously, checking for security personnel and trying to gauge how quickly she could move, if needed. The red rope barrier was low enough to step over easily, and James was only about 3 feet away from the edge. It would take just seconds to close that distance. The elderly British couple behind her sensed something was about to happen. "Oh dear," the woman murmured to her husband. I think our American friend is about to attempt something rather bold. James felt a change in the atmosphere around him. His peripheral vision caught subtle movements from the crowd, and his training kicked into high alert. Something was about to happen, and every instinct told him it involved the American woman who'd been watching him so intently. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the courtyard and creating perfect lighting for the hundreds of photos being taken. Street musicians in the distance added their melodies to the urban symphony, while pigeons strutted boldly between the tourists' feet, hoping for dropped crumbs. Sarah's heart pounded as she prepared to make her move. She knew the guards weren't supposed to break character, but she also knew they were human beings who deserved recognition for their dedication. In her mind, this wasn't about getting a viral video or impressing other tourists. It was about one person acknowledging another's service and sacrifice. Without giving herself time to reconsider, Sarah stepped over the red rope barrier. The movement was quick and fluid, catching most of the crowd off guard. Gasps rippled through the tourists as they realized what was happening. Phone cameras immediately swung in her direction, and parents pulled their children back instinctively. James saw her approach in his peripheral vision, and every muscle in his body tensed. His training screamed at him to remain still, to maintain his post, no matter what happened. Guards had dealt with protesters, overly enthusiastic fans, and even people trying to steal their hats. But something about Sarah's approach felt different. Not threatening or mocking, but gentle and respectful. "Excuse me," Sarah said softly as she reached James, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to thank you for your service." Before anyone could react, she wrapped her arms around the startled guardsman in a gentle, sincere hug. The crowd fell silent for a split second, the kind of absolute quiet that happens when something completely unexpected occurs. Then the whispers started, followed by the rapid clicking of camera shutters. Some tourists looked shocked, others concerned, and many were simply amazed that someone had actually made physical contact with one of the famously untouchable royal guards. James felt the warmth of Sarah's embrace, and for a moment, his rigid military bearing softened almost imperceptibly. In that instant, he wasn't Guardsman Thompson of the Coldstream Guards. He was just James, a young man from Manchester who'd been standing perfectly still for over an hour, whose feet ached in his polished boots, and who hadn't expected such, a genuine gesture of appreciation. Security personnel began moving toward them, but before they could intervene, something magical happened. Instead of maintaining his statue-like pose or calling for help, James made a decision that would surprise everyone present, including himself. He gently returned Sarah's hug. The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. Some people gasped audibly, others started applauding spontaneously, and dozens of phones captured the moment from every possible angle. Children pointed excitedly, while their parents stared in disbelief. The elderly British couple behind Sarah's original spot looked at each other with raised eyebrows and knowing smiles. "Did that actually just happen?" someone called out in an Australian accent. "Did the guard just hug her back?" For those few seconds, the formal boundary between performer and audience dissolved completely. It wasn't a tourist attraction anymore. It was a human moment happening in public, witnessed by hundreds of strangers who suddenly felt like they were part of something special. Sarah pulled back from the embrace, her eyes bright with unexpected emotion. She hadn't expected him to respond, and the fact that he had made her heart race with gratitude and surprise. "Thank you," she whispered again, looking directly into James's eyes. James, still maintaining most of his formal posture, gave her the slightest nod, barely perceptible to most observers, but clear enough to Sarah. In that tiny gesture, she saw acknowledgement, appreciation, and perhaps even a hint of gratitude for treating him like a person rather than a tourist attraction. The security officers reached them just as Sarah stepped back toward the barrier. Instead of the stern confrontation everyone expected, the lead officer simply helped her back over the rope with a surprisingly gentle touch. "Miss, "You'll need to stay behind the barrier," he said formally, but his tone wasn't harsh. As Sarah rejoined the crowd, the atmosphere had completely transformed. Tourists who had been strangers minutes before were suddenly talking to each other, sharing their amazement at what they'd witnessed. The German woman grabbed Sarah's arm excitedly. "I can't believe he hugged you back. In 20 years of coming. Here, I've never seen anything like that." James resumed his perfect posture, but something had changed. The rigid tension in his shoulders seemed slightly relaxed, and though his expression returned to its professional neutrality, there was a subtle warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The crowd began buzzing with theories and observations. "Maybe she reminded him of someone," suggested a teenage girl. "Or maybe he was just having a really good day," added her mother. Tour guides who had witnessed hundreds of ceremonies found themselves at a loss for explanation. Word of the incident began spreading beyond the immediate crowd. Other tourists arriving for the ceremony were quickly filled in by those who had witnessed the hug. The story grew slightly with each retelling. Some versions had James speaking to Sarah, others claimed he smiled, and a few insisted they saw tears in his eyes. But for Sarah, standing back behind the barrier with her heart still racing, the details didn't matter. She had followed her instinct to show appreciation to someone doing a difficult job, and somehow, miraculously, that appreciation had been received and returned. The fact that it happened in front of hundreds of strangers only made it feel more significant. The changing of the guard ceremony began right on schedule, but the atmosphere was unlike any other day. The tourists who had witnessed the hug found themselves watching James with special attention, as if they were now invested in his story. Every precise movement he made, every step in the elaborate drill seemed more meaningful because they had glimpsed the person behind the uniform. Sarah stood transfixed as she watched the ceremony unfold. The precision, the tradition, the sheer spectacle of it all felt even more impressive now that she'd had that brief human connection with one of the participants. She found herself noticing details she might have missed otherwise. The way the guards' movements were perfectly synchronized, how their faces remained focused despite the distractions around them. Other guards participating in the ceremony seemed unaware of what had happened with James. They moved through their choreographed routine with the same disciplined precision that had made them famous worldwide. But several tourists in the crowd kept glancing between the ceremony and their phones, already uploading photos and videos of the unexpected hug. James performed his duties flawlessly, but internally he was processing what had just occurred. In his 3 years of service, he'd developed what he thought was complete immunity to tourist antics. He'd seen marriage proposals, birthday celebrations, and even funeral commemorations happen in front of him without breaking character. But Sarah's simple, sincere gesture had touched something different. The ceremony proceeded through its traditional phases: the inspection, the key ceremony, the march past. Hundreds of tourists continued taking photos, but many found themselves also stealing glances at Sarah, the woman who had somehow broken through the invisible barrier that separated performers from audience. A news reporter who happened to be in the crowd for a routine tourism story suddenly realized she might have witnessed something more significant. She began quietly interviewing witnesses, gathering details about the unprecedented interaction between guard and tourist. She didn't do it for attention, the elderly British man told the reporter. It was genuine. You could see it in her face. And when he hugged her back, well, I've been coming to these ceremonies for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like it. The German woman who had befriended Sarah was more than happy to share her perspective. She was watching him with such respect, such appreciation. It wasn't like the other tourists trying to get selfies or make the guards laugh. She saw him as a person doing an important job, and I think he recognized that. As the ceremony continued, Sarah found herself thinking about James's life beyond this moment. Where was he from? Did he have family who worried about him? What had made him choose this path of service? The brief human connection had opened up questions she'd never considered before about the real people behind these iconic uniforms. Security personnel discreetly interviewed Sarah during the ceremony, more out of protocol than concern. She explained, her intentions honestly, emphasizing her respect for the guards and her gratitude for their service. The officers seemed satisfied that there had been no malicious intent, and her cooperative attitude helped smooth over any potential complications. Meanwhile, the photos and videos of the hug were already beginning to circulate on social media. The images captured something that seemed almost impossible. A moment of genuine human warmth in the middle of one of the most formal, traditional ceremonies in the world. James's fellow guards would later tease him good-naturedly about becoming famous, but they also understood what had happened. Each of them had felt the weight of being treated like a tourist attraction rather than a person. The fact that someone had approached James with genuine appreciation rather than entertainment-seeking made the story resonate with the entire regiment. The ceremony concluded with its usual precision, and as the guards marched away, many in the crowd found themselves applauding more enthusiastically than usual. It felt like they weren't just clapping for a performance anymore, but acknowledging the real people who made it possible. Sarah remained in her spot even after most tourists began dispersing. The experience had affected her more deeply than she'd expected. She'd come to London as a teacher on vacation, but she felt like she was leaving as someone who had participated in a small piece of history. The reporter approached Sarah as the crowd thinned. "Would you mind sharing what motivated you to do that?" she asked gently. "It's clearly resonated with a lot of people who witnessed it." Sarah thought for a moment before answering. "I teach high school back home, and I see how hard my students work for recognition and appreciation. Watching him stand there so perfectly, representing his country with such dignity, it just felt like someone should acknowledge that. I didn't expect him to respond the way he did, but I'm grateful he understood what I was trying to say." The story was already taking on a life of its own, but for Sarah, the most important part remained that brief moment of human connection with a dedicated soldier who had chosen to serve his country in a very visible, demanding way. By evening, the video of Sarah's hug with James had spread across multiple social media platforms. The footage, captured by dozens of different phones from various angles, showed the same heartwarming moment from every possible perspective. Comments poured in from around the world, with people sharing their own stories of appreciation for military service and unexpected human connections. Back at the barracks, James found himself at the center of attention for the first time in his military career. His fellow guards gathered around laptops and phones, watching the various videos of his moment of fame. Instead of ribbing him about breaking protocol, they seemed genuinely moved by what had happened. "Look at all these comments," said Guardsman Williams, scrolling through hundreds of responses. "People are saying it restored their faith in humanity. This American teacher has no idea how many people she's touched with that simple gesture." James felt a complex mix of emotions as he watched himself on screen. He could see the exact moment, when his training gave way to human instinct, when Sarah's genuine appreciation broke through years of conditioning to remain impassive. Part of him worried about potential disciplinary action, but a larger part felt proud that he'd responded with his heart. The commanding officer called James into his office that evening, and the young guardsman prepared for the worst. Instead, Colonel Harrison greeted him with an unexpected smile. "Thompson, I've been fielding calls from news outlets around the world. It seems you've become something of a celebrity." "Sir, I can explain," James began, but the colonel raised a hand to stop him. "No explanation necessary, Guardsman. I've watched the footage myself and I've read the witness accounts. You handled an unusual situation with dignity and humanity while maintaining the respect due to your uniform. The palace has received nothing but positive feedback about the interaction." Relief flooded through James as he realized he wasn't in trouble. In fact, the colonel continued. The incident had generated more positive publicity for the Royal Guard than any planned public relations campaign in recent memory. Meanwhile, Sarah had returned to her hotel to find her phone buzzing with notifications. Friends from home had seen the videos and were amazed that shy, reserved Sarah Mitchell had done something so bold and public. Messages flooded in from former students, fellow teachers, and even strangers who had been moved by her gesture. "Miss Mitchell," read one message from a former student, "I saw you on Instagram hugging the Queen's Guard. You always told us to treat everyone with respect and kindness, and you really showed us what that looks like." The story had caught the attention of news outlets beyond London. Morning talk shows in America were discussing it, and international news services were running segments about the tourist who melted a Royal Guard's heart. Sarah found herself both thrilled and overwhelmed by the response. A knock on her hotel room door interrupted her scrolling through messages. The reporter from earlier stood in the hallway with a camera crew, explaining that they were putting together a longer piece about the story for the evening news. Sarah agreed to an interview, hoping to share her perspective on what had become a global moment. "What made you decide to approach him?" the reporter asked as cameras rolled. Sarah chose her words carefully. "I work with young people every day, and I know how much it means when someone acknowledges your effort and dedication. These guards stand there for hours, representing their country with such professionalism. I just felt like someone should say thank you. I never expected it to become such a big story." The reporter pressed further. "Were you surprised when he hugged you back?" "Completely surprised," Sarah admitted with a smile. "I thought I might get in trouble or that security would rush over immediately. But for just a moment, it felt like two people connecting as human beings, which is really what I was hoping for." Back at Buckingham Palace, James was fielding his own interview requests. The Royal Guard's Public Relations Department, after consulting with senior officials, decided to allow him to make a brief statement to the press. They saw an opportunity to humanize the guards while maintaining their dignity and mystique. Standing in his dress uniform before a small group of reporters, James spoke with the same quiet dignity he displayed on duty. The Royal Guard represents centuries of tradition and service to the crown, but we're also ordinary people who appreciate kindness and respect. Today's interaction reminded me why we serve, to protect and represent not just our sovereign, but the values that bring people together. Social media continued buzzing with reaction to his statement. Many people expressed surprise at hearing a Royal Guard speak publicly about personal feelings, while others praised the honesty and humility of his words. The story began evolving beyond just the hug itself. People started sharing their own experiences, of unexpected human connections with strangers, of moments when someone's kindness had made a difference in their day. Sarah's simple gesture had sparked a broader conversation about recognition, appreciation, and the power of treating everyone with dignity. Travel websites began featuring the story as an example of respectful tourism, while military support organizations used it to highlight the importance of acknowledging service members' sacrifices. The moment that had lasted just seconds in a London courtyard was inspiring discussions about humanity and connection around the world. 6 months later, Sarah received an unexpected letter at her school in Ohio. The return address read, Coldstream Guards Regiment, London. Inside, she found a handwritten note from James, along with an official photograph of him in his full ceremonial uniform. "Dear Miss Mitchell," the letter began, "I hope this finds you well. I wanted to write personally to thank you for your kindness during your visit to London. Your gesture meant more to me and my fellow guardsmen than you might realize. It reminded us that behind our ceremonial duties, we serve real people who appreciate our dedication to duty and country." The letter went on to explain how the incident had positively impacted not just James, but the entire regiment. Tour guides now frequently shared the story with visitors as an example of how respectful interaction could create meaningful moments. The palace had even incorporated elements of the story into their official materials about the changing role of modern ceremonial duties. Sarah shared the letter with her students, who had made her something of a local celebrity after the video. Went viral. They had watched the footage dozens of times and peppered her with questions about her trip to London. The letter became part of a lesson about kindness, respect, and how small gestures can have unexpected consequences. "See?" she told her class, holding up James's photograph. "This is why we talk about treating everyone with dignity. You never know when a simple thank you or gesture of appreciation might make someone's day, or even change their perspective." James had indeed experienced changes in his perspective. The positive response to their interaction had reinforced his pride in serving, but it had also made him more aware of the tourists as individuals, rather than just crowds to ignore. He began to appreciate the wonder in children's eyes when they saw the guards, and he noticed the respect in veterans' faces when they watched the ceremonies. The video of their hug had accumulated millions of views across various platforms, spawning countless reaction videos and discussion threads. Mental health advocates used it to discuss the importance of human connection, while tourism boards cited it as an example of positive cultural exchange. A documentary filmmaker reached out to both Sarah and James about participating in a longer project about unexpected human connections in public spaces. While James declined due to military protocols, Sarah agreed to share her story as part of a broader exploration of how spontaneous kindness could create ripple effects across communities. The story had taken on a life far beyond what either participant had imagined. Universities used it in courses about social psychology and viral media, while customer service trainers showed the video as an example of how personal recognition could transform interactions. For Sarah, the most meaningful outcome wasn't the global attention, but the letters she received from other travelers sharing their own stories of connection. People wrote about thanking street performers, helping lost tourists, or simply smiling at service workers. Her moment of appreciation had inspired others to look for opportunities to acknowledge the people around them. James continued his duties with renewed purpose, knowing that his service represented something meaningful to people around the world. He'd learned that maintaining tradition didn't require sacrificing humanity, and that sometimes the most powerful moments happened when formal boundaries briefly dissolved. The elderly British couple who had witnessed the original hug became regular visitors to the palace, often sharing the story with other tourists. They had printed out some of the best photos from that day and kept them in a small album, showing them to friends as evidence that magic could still happen in the most unexpected places. 2 years later, Sarah returned to London with a group of her students on an educational trip. As they stood behind the familiar red barriers watching the changing of the guard ceremony, she told them the story of her previous visit. The students listened with rapt attention, occasionally glancing at the guards and imagining the person behind each uniform. James had been promoted and was no longer stationed at the public ceremonies, but Sarah learned from a friendly guard that her story had become part of the regiment's informal history. New guards were told about the American teacher who had shown such genuine appreciation that it had touched hearts around the world. As Sarah watched her students experience the ceremony with wide eyes and excited whispers, she reflected on how one moment of following her heart had created connections she never could have anticipated. The simple act of acknowledging another person's service had demonstrated the universal power of human kindness. The red barriers still separated tourists. From guards, the ceremony still proceeded with centuries-old precision, and the guards still maintained their legendary discipline. But everyone who heard the story of Sarah and James carried with them a reminder that behind every uniform, every role, every public face, there was a real person worthy of recognition and respect. The moment, captured in dozens of phone videos, had lasted only seconds, but its message continued spreading. That genuine human connection could happen anywhere. That appreciation had the power to transform both giver and receiver. and that sometimes the most meaningful interactions happened when people chose to see beyond surfaces to the humanity underneath.